This is another in our series of interviews about the Canadian election, the party platforms, and we've been talking about the CPC platform today and carbon pricing with Michael Bernstein, who's an economist with Canadians for Clean Prosperity. So welcome to the interview, Michael.
Good to be with you, Markham.
Well, look, can you give us an overview of the CPC's take on and their proposals for changes to Canada's carbon pricing, both at the on the consumer side and on the industrial side, please?
Sure. Yeah, so I'll start with the good news. The good news is that for the first time in history, the Federal Conservative Party is proposing a carbon pricing plan. And that is significant in its own right. So I do want to give the party some credit for that. Having said that, the design of the policy is a significant departure from what we currently have with the federal government. It would weaken the policy signal quite significantly in the following ways. The first thing is that the price itself would stop at $50 maximum, whereas the current trajectory for the federal government is to go to $170 a ton in 2030. So a much lower price, in short. And then the second piece is that instead of is how they would use the revenue. So what they are proposing is that any money each individual pays in carbon taxes will stay with that individual, but just in a dedicated low carbon savings account, they're calling it. And that account would allow that individual to use the money, but only on specified goods that were considered low carbon. So that's the main thing that will affect you and I as individuals. There also are some changes to the industrial side of things, the policy that affects steel mills and cement plants and other heavy industry. And there the differences are less significant. It's just that Mr. O'Toole has said that he will first try to consult with other allies like the Americans to see if he can come up with some sort of coordinated industrial strategy. And if he can't do that, he may revert back to the current industrial system.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't read it that way. I read it that they were going to peg the rate that for industrial emitters to whatever the US and the EU have. And Jen Winter, the economist at the University of Calgary, said, well, that makes no sense because they have cap and trade systems. They're incompatible. They have, one deals with price and the other one deals with quantity of emissions, and you can't peg the two. But you read it as looking at maybe a matching system, something a partner on?
Yeah, so there is some ambiguity there, and you're right to point it out. I think if you look at the actual modeling that was released with their climate plan in April, what it showed was a industrial carbon price that does rise to $170 a ton by 2030, but with a little bit of uncertainty in the short term. So they didn't start the modeling again until 2025. And I think it kind of brings up a larger point with the plan, which is I suspect that the plan itself is a starting point to build off should the Conservatives form government. But I also would anticipate and frankly hope that the party would consider maybe some enhancements, some changes in design to each component of that policy to strengthen it and make it more feasible to implement.
Well, before we get off the industrial emitters policy, I want to make a point about the current system, and this is true in Alberta and other provinces that have adopted this, and as well as the federal backstop, and that is there's an output-based allocation system to protect industries that are competing against, countries that don't have, or businesses in countries that don't have carbon pricing. And so there's actually a discount to the carbon price. And it's very steep. It's like 80 or 90%. And so if there's, it seems like these changes the CPC are advocating are to provide better protection for Canadian companies, but the government already has control of the discount rate. It can provide as much protection as it wants simply by adjusting whether that discount is 90% or 50% or whatever it wants. And it's such a simple and easy to administer system. I just wanted to make that point. Would you agree?
Yeah, so yes, I would agree. And I'll tell you, there's another connected issue to that, which is that if we are eventually going to net zero, which is where we need to get, it's very hard to see how that industrial system stays intact over the long term. Because today there's over 40% of our emissions that are part of this industrial system. And we can't have this heavy discount over the long term. Not to mention our trading partners are starting to look at other mechanisms like border carbon adjustments, which I know we've talked about in the past.
Right, and just one final point. There seems to be a shift, and Navius mentioned this in the modeling actually, from there's less emphasis in the CPC platform on carbon pricing and more on industrial policy. And that's actually a legitimate debate. I mean, economists are debating that all over the place. But
yeah, that is true. I would point out, though, that the regulations that were put in place would have to get significantly tighter beyond 2030. I can see, I think Mr. O'Toole has presented a credible path to the old Paris target of 30% using regulations, but those regulations have to get a lot stricter and will pose a lot higher costs later down the road on our way to net zero. So that's where I think it may get challenging for him to continue with that approach.
That's a very good observation, Michael. Thank you. Well, let's talk about on the consumer side, and please explain to me how this this carbon price account is going to work, because everybody I've talked to seems to think that it's going to be very convoluted to administer and probably will not have the kind of effect that Navius claimed in the modeling, because they said it would be more effective than the current system.
Yeah, so the one thing that Navius pointed out, which I think is legitimate, is that by keeping the money with the person who paid the carbon tax, you will get some benefit for the following reason. It's mainly to do actually with business, that small businesses are going to be able to keep the money they pay in carbon tax, whereas today, most of that money is actually sent to households. And so by doing that, you will have small business both face lower cost, may be better for the economy, and also they may be able to invest more in lower carbon goods. So that was the positive part of it. Now, what was interesting though about the modeling from Navius is actually the reductions that are shown in the plan are driven almost entirely, in fact, I think it's exclusively from those regulations you referred to earlier, and not the carbon price itself. If there is an effect, it's a very modest impact of the carbon price. It's really relying on those other policies.
And is that small impact a result of scaling the carbon price back?
Yes, that's exactly why. So a $50 a ton carbon price, to give you a rough idea, I don't have the modeling in front of me, but I've done other modeling that I can give you a rough range, is going to give you something like 30, 35, 40 megatons, something in that range of reductions. Whereas $170 a ton price, now you're talking about 100 tons or megatons rather, or more. So, it's maybe 3 times, not so surprising because the price is more than 3 times greater. You're going to get something like 3 times more impact.
Right. So to wrap up, Michael, my impression is that the CPC, they wanted to have a carbon pricing system in their plan, and they also have the political problem of calling it a carbon tax. And the account the personal account is in part so they don't have to run the money through the government, and therefore they can say it's not a tax because it's not collected by the government. But anyway, nevertheless, it seems like the system they've come up with is not as elegant. It just doesn't work as well. It seems awkward. And on both the personal and the industrial emitter side, would you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, my hope is that this is a starting point for the policy they'll end up with, but not the end point. I think that I understand and appreciate what they were trying to do, and I recognize that they have some challenges within their own caucus and their own voter base. But the reality is this will be, I think, very difficult to implement. And so I am cautiously optimistic that there may be some room for improvement if the Conservatives were to form government.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for your insights. I understand the CPC carbon pricing proposals much better now. Thank you.
Thank you.